Sorry about the lighting. I'm reading this book. It's great. I recommend it. I'm at the part where they're talking about craniometry, which is a science they created in order to try to prove that non-white people had less intelligence biologically. And this dude, I don't even care if you know his name, measured skull volume by putting mustard seed and lead shot, and then determined that certain people with greater skull volume had greater intelligence. And it just seems so silly to me, particularly the mustard seed and the lead shot part. It's tremendously dehumanizing, of course. And I think the ridiculous of it makes me laugh in this kind of eerie way, this dark way of like, they thought they could measure intelligence by pouring stuff into people's empty skulls. I was trying to think of a metaphor for like the ridiculousness of this concept. And a lot of things come to mind, you know. We could talk about the size matters of it all. But intelligence is, first of all, you can't measure it. It's super subjective, and a lot of elements come into play. Plus, it varies, you know, culturally. It varies depending on what subject you're talking about. It varies based on somebody's energy level, stress level. And again, it's subjective and really cannot be measured. Even in this book, they talk about how IQ tests that were used to systematically oppress Black and immigrant people in the United States held a lot of cultural biases that essentially ended up being a confirmation bias. So that people who were non-white, differently educated, whose first language was not English, and so forth, would perform poorly on the tests, leading to a confirmation bias that they were less intelligent. And then that was used to oppress them in various ways. And this makes me think of the movie Selma Lord Selma, where they show Black people showing up to try to vote, and they're asked to guess how many marbles or something is in a jar. And to me, as a white kid, I was like, that seems fun. I love guessing how many things are in a jar. I won a whole jar of candy corn as a kid doing that. But the woman was really offended, and I never quite understood it until I was thinking about it right now in the context of this. And it's just another level of ridiculousness, dehumanization, even infantilization, an unnecessary barrier to what is supposed to be, quote-unquote, God-given, liberty, the right to vote in a democratic society. They were being made to tap dance for their supper, so to speak. That's making me think about the silliness of, you know, pouring mustard seed into a skull on its surface. Because if you don't consider the generational trauma, the greater socio-political context, it can just seem silly, and that could make it seem innocuous. But they were doing these things to try to prove, to try to justify that the systemic violence and oppression against non-white people, against people considered less than human or less than in any way, to keep them from access, to keep them from resources, to keep them from equality. The metaphor I came up with is, it's like trying to determine someone's favorite color by dipping their eyeballs in milk. And to me, that brings out the kind of inherent violence that's at play here that the silliness kind of glosses over. He was measuring skull sizes, human skulls, taking a dead body and pouring mustard seed or lead shot into it to try to determine whether that body deserved the oppression and violence it endured while it was living. It makes a mockery of the very real suffering that millions upon millions of people have experienced historically because of these made-up ideas that some people are better than others. Race was made up to try to justify violence and oppression, and to try to maintain an economic system and the ways in which it benefited those at the top. One more thing I want to say is that the ridiculousness, I think, highlights the extreme effort they have to put in to try to prove their own conclusion, to try to construct a reality in which their conclusion is correct. Because the reality in which their conclusion is correct doesn't exist. And you can see this later in the chapter I was reading from. Ironically, President Bill Clinton's famous announcement in 2000 that decoding of the human genome revealed human genetic sequences as 99.9% identical, surely the death knell of biological race, seems only to have inspired proponents of racial genetics. So even in the face of scientific proof that we are literally more alike than we are different, race scientists and racists continue to push for the idea that we are so genetically different that it justifies slavery and mass systemic violence and oppression. Oh, just a quick note on the guy who was measuring skull sizes. A 1981 re-examination of Morton's work showed he skewed the results by excluding skulls that didn't fit his expectations. Of course he did.